Hello everyone, this video series is about the external morphology of insects. So this particular video is about head region. The insect head is a hard, highly sclerotized compact capsule bearing a group of feeding appendages around the mouth, sensory organs and internally a major center of neuroendocrine coordination. Head segmentation. It is absolutely impossible to recognize the segmentation of the head from its morphology in the adult condition. The embryological studies may however help in solving the problem. According to phylogenetic considerations, the insect head is in fact a product of evolution and can be termed as a syncephalon. It consists of two parts, an anterior procephalon and a posterior gnathocephalon. The procephalon represents preoral region of the head and bears two paired structures, the eyes and the antennae. The procephalon is thought to be derived from the ancestral head, the archicephalon or blastocephalon, after an incorporation of at least one posterior trunk segment of the anterior ancestor. The brain is considered as a fused ganglion of the procephalon. The gnathocephalon represents postoral region of the head. It bears three paired structures, the mandibles, first maxilla and second maxilla or labium. The gnathocephalon seems to be absolutely arthropodal structure. It is mostly developed in order to equip the head with feeding appendages. Embryological and morphological studies suggest unequivocally that the gnathocephalon is composed of three segments like mandibular, maxillary, and labial segments. In an adult insect, these segments are evident from their paired appendages. The subesophageal ganglion is undoubtedly a composite ganglion of the gnathocephalon. There is no controversy about the segmentation of gnathocephalon. The segmentation of procephalon is all the while a subject of dispute. In this regard, various theories have been proposed from time to time, and the discussion on this subject due to its multifold impact is ever interesting. So the classical theory. This theory is mostly based on embryonic evidences such as presence of neuromers, embryonic segmental appendages and coelomic sacs. Goodrich in 1897 proposed on the basis of embryonic evidences that the procephalon is formed from the anteriormost three somites along the unsegmented apical acron. These somites or metamers of prosencephalon are commonly called preantennal, antennal and intercalary segments respectively. The preantennal segment is characterized by containing protocerebral part of the brain, the first pair of cephalic coelomic sacs, and limb primordia in some insects. In adult states, this segment is devoid of appendages. The antennal segment consists of deutocerebral part of the brain, the second pair of cephalic coelomic sacs in the embryo, and a pair of antennae as the segmental appendages. Then the intercalary segment bears tritocerebral part of the brain, the third pair of coelomic sacs in the embryo, but devoid of segmental appendages in the adult condition. It is homologous to the second antennal segment of the crustacea. And this theory therefore holds that the insect head is composed of six segments, the prosencephalon and gnathocephalon, each formed of three segments. The theory has been accepted by a large number of prominent entomologists, although they differ in nomenclature of the respective segments and in consideration of segmental appendages. According to Lancaster in 1881 and Violanes in 1887, I'm not sure about the pronunciation of the scientist's name, I'm sorry. The eye stalks are the appendages of the first segment and to be named as the ocular segment, while Tiggs in Manton consider that the first segment is labral, having labium as its appendage. There is also a third group of workers, Ince, Weber and Rampel and Church, suggested the first segment is preantennal, one bearing no appendages, which has been universally accepted. Two prominent insect morphologists, Snodgrass and Duporte, consider the eyes and antennae as the structures belonging to the acron and not to any head segment. Their major argument against the classical theory is that not even a single species of insect in its embryonic condition shows the presence of three distinct coelomic sacs and limb primordia, and thus the validity of the theory is incompetent, deductive, and misleading to a great extent. The labral segmental theory, next theory, Weismann reported two preantennal segments with two paired rudimentary sacs in the embryo of a stick insect. The first of these is the labral segment with the labrum as a fused appendage, while the second one is the preantennal segment without appendages in the adult stage. So Runwald in 1937 and Gingran in 1947 also found two preantennal coelomic sacs in the embryo of the Locusta and Schistocerca. All these workers concluded that the procephalon is a four-segmented structure, and ultimately the head is overall composed of 7 segments: the labral, the preantennal and antennal and intercalary or premandibular, forming the prosencephalon, and the mandibula, the maxillary and the labial segments forming the gnathocephalon. Then Runwald suggested that the protocerebrum is composed of two pairs of neuromeres, one is labral and the one preantennal, belonging to the labral and preantennal segments respectively. And the third one is the sublingual segmental theory. So first one was the classical theory, then next the labral segmental theory, third one the superlingual segmental theory. Some workers mostly working in the embryonic development of the epterygote insects noticed a pair of appendages known as superlingui. The hypopharynx is supposed to be formed due to fusion of the median lingua with a pair of lateral superlingui. These superlingui are considered as the paired appendages belonging to the superlingual segment. Then some other scientists confirmed the presence of the superlingual segment in between the intercalary and the mandibular segments in Nepterygota. Thermobia domestica. According to him, the insect head is made up of 7 segments in all: preantennal, antennal, intercalary and superlingual segments constituting the procephalon, and mandibular, maxillary and labial segments representing the gnathocephalic part of the head. Then the whole Holmgren Hanstorm theory. According to the scientists, the antennae and the eyes are belonging to the acron, and these structures cannot be accounted as a procephalic segmental appendages as suggested by earlier workers believed in the classical theory. Their theory is principally based on the skeleto-muscular and neuroanatomical systems of large number of annelids and arthropods. They believe that the proto and deuterocerebral parts of the insect brain are secondarily differentiated from the annelidian brain or from the archicerebrum. In this way, they have maintained close homology between the arthropod and archicephalon and the annelidian postomium. The procephalon of insect head is therefore formed after fusion of a single postoral segment, the intercalary segment, with the archicephalon or acron. This theory is further thoroughly supported by some other scientists. Second antennae might have been lost in the insects, and the labrum appears to be the appendage of intercalary segment. Labrum as a pre-oral structure, while Duporte as a part of the first somite. According to these workers, the intercalary segment is the first true segment with the tritocerebrum as its ganglion. This theory maintains that the insect head is composed of acron and 4 segments. The segments are the intercalary segment incorporated into the procephalon and acron, mandibular, maxillary and labial segments incorporated into the gnathocephalon. Then the Ferris-Henry theory brought forward a theory of head segmentation on the basis of external morphology of the head in adult insects and annelids and nerve innervation of cephalic region in case of the Ferris-Henry theory. So according to Ferris, the head is composed of 6 segments. These segments are demarcated externally by the transverse sutures. The segments are termed as labral, clipial, oculoantennal, mandibular, maxillary and labial. So according to him, the intercalary segment has fantastically investigated and does not bear the true identity as well as any relevant evidence. The head consists of the labral segment as the anteriormost segment, and there are no pre-oral structures. He believes that Polychaetes proboscis is represented in the insect head by the first 3 segments and is therefore metameric or opposed to the stomidial origin. The eyes and the antennae are prostomial in origin. Henry asserted that a ganglion as a rule innervates the same segment to which it belongs. The tritocerebrum, therefore, is ganglion of a labral segment. This theory is discarded by several workers on the plea that the head sutures are merely the secondary developed unsclerotized regions of lines formed due to internal ridges. They may appear simply as lines of weakness along emergence of the succeeding insta from the old exuvia during molting. The homology made by Henry in between the annelidian proboscis and preoral part of insect head is also ruled out, as the nerve innervation is altogether different. Again, embryonic evidence does not support this theory. So we learned some important theories, and I know it's a bit confusing, so investigate with me. So just read this. First theory was the classical theory. Next one, this labral segmental theory. Classical theory, labral segmental theory. Then the superlingual segmental theory. Along with that, the Holmgren Hanstorm theory. Scientists invented this theory. Then the Ferris Henry theory. Yeah, that's it. So these are the 5 important theories related to the head segmentation in insects, which are the classical theory, the labral segmental theory, the superlingual segmental theory, along with the Holmgren Hanstorm theory, the Ferris Henry theory. Wait a minute, once again. Classical theory, labral segmental theory, the superlingual segmental theory, and the Holmgren Hanstorm theory, and the Ferris Henry theory. Next is about head skeleton. The head of the insect loses its primary segmentation during the post-embryonic development. Due to enormous sclerotization, the head becomes a hard skeletal capsule. It bears externally a set of sensory and gnathal appendages. The sense organs include a pair of antennae, a pair of compound eyes, and 2 or 3 ocelli. The gnathal appendages comprise of a pair of mandibles, a pair of maxillae, and a labium. The gnathal appendages constitute collectively along the labrum and hypopharynx and a well-elaborated feeding apparatus. The position of the mouth parts in relation to the body axis differs in different groups of insects. The mouth parts may project downward, forward, or backward in the neck, and the head accordingly is designed as a hypognathous orthopteroid insects, prognathous, some dipteran flies and larval coleoptera, and opistognathous, hemiptera, Thysanoptera. Okay, hypognathous, prognathous, and opistognathous. The head sutures. The head capsule of the mature insects is differentiated into several regions by the sutures. The sutures are nothing but the secondarily developed fine grooves. Although the true nature and morphological significance of the sutures is still incompletely understood, they are inflictions or merely external impressions of the internal stiff cuticular ridges which provide mechanical support to the radial wall. Some workers have taken into account the sutures as the intersegmental lines, but now it is well established that these structures are the product of sclerotization, and except the post-occipital sutures, others have no metameric significance. So, the common sutures of the insect head are described below. So, we'll be learning all that one by one. The first, the clipiolabral suture. Clipiolabral suture. This suture represents the lower margin of the clipius. The labrum is hanging down from the suture. It bears a prominent ridge internally. First one, the clipiolabral suture. The clipiolabral suture. The suture represents the lower margin of the clipius. The labrum is hanging down from the suture. It bears a prominent ridge internally. The ridge possesses an apogee at the center. So the apogee provides an insertion to the anterior retractor muscles of the labrum. And the clipiofrontal or the next suture. First one was the clipiolabral suture. First one, in the sense we are describing them one by one. So in that sense, the first one. That doesn't mean it is the first thing you just gaze into in case of a suture. It's not like that. The first one in this context is clipiolabral suture. The next, the clipiofrontal or epistomal suture. It occurs between the clipeus and the frons. It bears laterally the anterior tentoral pits. It internally bears a strong inflection. This inflection strengthens the lower part of the head against the stretching of the mandibles. Then the epicranial suture, it is a composite suture. It appears in the form of an inverted Y above the facial region in most of the insects. This stem is known as the coronal and the lateral arms and the frontal sutures. The epicranial suture is partially or even completely reduced in some insects. It is totally lacking from the head of pterygoids. Snodgrass and Duporte stated that the epicranial suture represents merely the line of weakness and can be said in true sense that the ecdysial suture. It does not bear the skeletal ridge on the inner surface and therefore does not provide either a site for muscle attachment or mechanical support to the head capsule. So as it's kind of difficult to interpret and interpretation, so I would be just skimming through the portion, like stating the suture name. The occipital suture, then the post-occipital suture, the frontogenal or subocular suture, the subgenal suture, the ocular sutures, then the antennal sutures, the head sclerites or aries, and the labrum, then the compressor of labral, then anterior labral, the posterior labral, the clipeus, wait a minute, till now we were learning about the sutures. Next is about the sclerites. So the fourth one, the occipital suture. It is the horseshoe or U-shaped suture and well evident on the posterior part of the head of the orthopteroid insects. It starts from posterior articulations of the mandibles of either side. Both the arms, after running a long distance, join one another above the occipital foramen. It separates the genal area from the post-genal area of the lateral region of the head. It also differentiates the vertex from the occiput in posterior region of the head. It forms an internal ridge strengthening the posterior epicranial wall. In the post-occipital suture, it embraces the occipital foramen magnum from the dorsal and lateral sides. Each end of the suture merges in the hypostomal suture in ventral region. The site is well defined due to the presence of the posterior tentoral pits. It possesses internally a strong epididymal ridge, the post-occipital ridge. It provides a site for the attachment of prothoracic muscles which move a pair of ventrolateral condyles. The neck membrane is firmly attached to this ridge. The condyles articulate with the neck sclerites. It is the only suture having the metameric significance, which when the post-occipital suture. It is the only suture having the metameric significance. It alone marks the fusion of maxillary and labial segments of the head. And the frontogenal or subocular suture. It develops in each lateral region of the head. It starts from the junction of the clipiofrontal and the subgenal sutures. And the frontogenal or subocular suture. It develops on each lateral region of the head. It starts from the junction of the clipiofrontal and the subgenal sutures. It terminates in the close vicinity of the lower margin of each compound eye. It is usually well evident in the orthopteroid insects. Then the subgenal suture. These sutures occur on the lateral sides of the head. Each suture joins the posterior tentoral pit with the anterior tentoral pit of the same side. Each suture is divisible into two parts. One pair of the subgenal suture is called the hypostomal suture. The hypostomal suture runs from the posterior tentoral pit up to the posterior articulation of the mandible. The other part of the subgenal suture is called the pleurostomal suture. The pleurostomal suture arches over the mandibles and finally joins with the frontoclipial and the frontogenal sutures just above the anterior articulation of the mandibles. Internally, subgenal sutures form the subgenal ridges. Each ridge extends from the posterior tentorial pit to a point just above the anterior articulation of the mandible. The subgenal sutures strengthen the radial wall along the lines of attachment of the genal gnathal appendages. Then the ocular sutures are the annular grooves around the compound eyes. They form the skeletal ridges internally. So we mentioned some important head sutures like the clipiolabral, the clipiofrontal, also called the epistomal, then the epicranial, then the occipital, along with post-occipital, then frontoginal or subocular suture, and the subginal sutures. I hope you at least remember the name. I'm struggling with this. The head sutures, the clipiolabral suture, the clipiofrontal or epistomal suture, the epiranial suture, the occipital suture, the post-occipital suture, the frontoginal or subocular suture, the subginal suture, the ocular sutures, then the antennal sutures. These are the marginal depressed ring along the antennal sockets and known as the antennal sutures. Each suture gives internally the submarginal ridge. The submarginal ridge in a larger number of insects bears a pivot-like process known as the antennifer. The antennifer provides articulation to the antennae. Then the head sclerites or areas. Next topic. Sclerites. The cuticular areas can be seen in the external surface of the head. They become well evident after dechitination when treated with aqueous KOH at high temperature. These areas of the head capsule are also known as head sclerites. The sclerites represent simply the intersutural areas. The head of the generalized insect is typically exhibiting the following sclerites. The labrum. It is widely discussed structure of the head. Some workers have regarded it as a fused segmental appendage, which is now universally accepted as a sclerite of the head. It is freely attached to the lower margin of the clypeus by the clipiolabral structure, generally hanged over the mouth or the preoral cavity, and also termed as an upper lip, particularly in mandibulate insects. In the fluid feeding insects, this undergoes various modifications. So internally it forms anterior part of the epipharyngeal wall of the preoral cavity. It is internally lined with the gustatory receptors and can be moved upward, downward, and be pulled and pushed to some extent due to the elastic nature of the suture and muscle innervation. Which one? The labrum. The labrum is innervated by following three types of muscles. The compressor labral, they may occur in a pair on lateral sides or a single median one. They are attached by one end on the anterior and by the other end on the posterior wall of the labrum. The compressors bring the retraction, prolongation, and contraction of the labrum. Then the anterior labral. They are the paired but unbranched labral muscles. They originate from the inner surface of the fronts. They move the labrum in forward direction. Anterior labral. Then the posterior labral. They are the paired but branched labral muscles. They originate from the anterior lateral regions of the fronts. These muscles pull the labrum backward. The clypeus. This sclerite is demarcated by the clipiolabral and clipiofrontal sutures from the anterior and posterior sides. It thus occupies the position in between the anterior labral and posterior frontal sclerites. In some insects, it is completely or partially divided into two parts by a transverse suture. The posterior part is termed as the postclypeus and the anterior part is termed as the anticlypeus. Both parts of the clypeus can be seen in case of crickets. The postclypeus modifies into a convex process termed as ginglymus of the mandible. It is a sclerite of the head on which arise the sebareal dilator muscles. Then the frons. It extends from the anterior clipiofrontal suture to the posterior frontal suture. In the orthopteroid insects, it possesses the median ocellus. In some cases, it may bear the lateral ocelli also. Whenever the clipiofrontal suture remains ill-defined, the anterior temporal pits reveal the demarcation of this sclerite from the clipial region. For example, in the case of cockroaches. The frons represents typically an upper facial region of the head. The pharyngeal dilators, labral, hypopharyngeal muscles, and the adductors of mandibles are usually inserted on the middle of the frons. The epiranium. The epiranial suture separates the epirania from the fronts. It represents the entire upper region on top of the head. It extends from the anterior frontal to the posterior occipital suture. About the fronts, it is divided by the coronal suture into two identical lateral plates known as parietals. The parietals are characterized by bearing the antennae, lateral ocelli, and the compound eyes. The posterior undivided region of the epicranium is known as vertex. It forms top of the head. The independent status of the vertex as a sclerite is still controversial. Then the occiput. It is the U-shaped posterior or intercuticular band. It represents the area from the occipital to the post-occipital suture. In the higher insects, however, the occipital suture is obscure. And the post-occiput. The occipital foramen is encircled from the dorsal and lateral regions by a narrow sclerite, the post-occiput. It lies between the occiput and the neck. The post-occiput is marked off from the occiput by a transverse post-occipital suture. And the post-occipital suture remains absent. The posterior tentorial pits separate the post-occiput from the occiput. The dorsal thoracic muscles are attached to the endoskeletal ridge of the post-occipital suture. These muscles articulate the head freely. The anterior lateral inner margin of the post-occiput produces small processes. These sutures are termed as the occipital condyles. Each condyle articulates with the anterior lateral cervical sclerite. And the post-occiput we mentioned. The occipital foramen is encircled from the dorsal and lateral regions by a narrow sclerite, the post-occiput. It lies between the occiput and the neck. The post-occiput is marked off from the occiput by a transverse post-occipital suture, and the post-occipital suture remains absent. The posterior tentorial pits separate the post-occiput from the occiput. The dorsal thoracic muscles are attached to the endoskeletal ridge of the post-occipital suture. These muscles articulate the head freely. The anterior lateral inner margin of the post-occiput produces small processes. The sutures are termed as the occipital condyles. Each condyle articulates with the anterior lateral cervical sclerite. Then the genae and subgenal areas. The genae represent the lateral areas of the head. On either side, the genae extend from the compound eyes to the mandibular trochanter. The hinter part develops into the socket to accommodate the mandibular condyle. Posterior to the occipital suture, each lateral gena is commonly called as the postgena. Each postgena provides the condylar articulation for the maxillae. The subgenal area above and below the mandibles can be referred to as the pleurostoma and hypostoma, respectively. These areas are separated in some insects by the suture, the hypostomal suture. Similarly, the pleurostomal sutures represents the pleurostoma from the base of mandibles. The ocular sclerites, they form a cuticular ring around each compound eye. The antennal sclerites, they form an annulus at the base of each antennae. The antennal sclerites are well developed in Plecoptera. Then the mandibular trochanter. It occurs quite distinctly between the mandibular base and the pleurostoma or the pleurostomal suture. The sclerites and their bearing on the head segmentation. According to Kuhl, Ferris, and Matsuda, the sclerites represents the segments and the sutures, the intersegmental lines. It is, however, true for the post-occipital suture, as it acts as an intersegmental line in between the maxillary and the labial segments. But the same generalization cannot be made for other sutures. So till this we mentioned some important sutures along with some sclerites of the head. Sutures in the sense the clipiolabral suture, the clipiofrontal or epistomal suture, the epiranial suture, the occipital suture, the post-occipital suture, then the frontogenal or subocular, subgenal, ocular, and the antennal sutures. Okay, and the head sclerites. Labrum is considered to be a sclerite. Then the compressor labral, then antennal labral, posterior labral, the clipeus frons, epiranium, occiput, the post-occiput, the genae and subgenal areas, and the ocular sclerites, antennal sclerites, the mandibular trochanter, the sclerites and their bearing on the head segmentation. Okay. And next is about tentorium. And later we will be mentioning some important aspects related to antennae, and then some portions related to the cervix or neck region. Okay, so let's learn about tentorium. It is an endoskeletal structure. It is composed of three pairs of arms, the anterior, posterior, and dorsal tentorial arms. The anterior tentorial arms develops from the anterior tentorial pits in the subgenal or epistomal suture. The posterior tentorial arms arise from the posterior tentorial pits in the lower ends of the post-occipital suture. The dorsal tentorial arms take origin in the form of secondary outgrowths of the anterior arms. All these tentorial arms unite in the middle, forming an unexpanded central skeletal platform. It may simply constitute a structure resembling the X or the Greek letter pi. The presence of a broad tentorium plate occurs commonly in the pterygote insects and is commonly known as a corporotentorium. The anterior and posterior arms of the tentorium vary largely in the size from one group of insects to other. In some orthopteran insects like the cockroaches, a pair of median processes arise at the base of the anterior arms and after union form an anterior bridge. A similar type of skeletal bridge can also be produced by the posterior arms and is extensively developed in the termite soldier. The tentorium is bracing the epicranial walls. It serves as a site for the attachment to the ventral adductor muscles of the nasal appendages, the retractor muscles of the hypopharynx, and also to the ventral dilators of the stomodium. In most of the insects, the antennal muscles are attached to the dorsal arms of the tentorium. In the apterygote insects, no homologous structure can be seen. In tentorium, therefore, seems to be an important evolutionary advancement in the pterygote insects. It appears to be formed of tergal and sternal elements. The anterior arms develop as the sternal apophysis and the posterior arms as the tergal apodemes. The tentorium in insects so that's about tentorium. Endoskeletal structure, three pairs of arms, the anterior, posterior, and dorsal tentorial arms. And the modifications of head capsule. The anterior frontoclypeal and the posterior lateral as well as ventral regions of the head capsule are greatly modified in some insects. Like frontoclypeal region, the epistomal suture is wanting in cockroaches and some other insects, in which the clypeal region can be separated from the frontal region by the position of anterior tentorial pits. Sometimes the frontal suture are also indistinct. In the hemiptera, hymenoptera, and lepidopteran larvae, the front is greatly reduced or suppressed. In these insects, on the basis of position of dilators of cibarium or that of buccal cavity, the clypeal region can be recognized. Similarly, the frontal region can be identified by the position of median ocellus and origin of labial muscles. Hypostomal bridge. In Hymenoptera, Heteroptera, Diptera, and Lepidopteran larvae, the labium is basally separated from the foramen magnum due to the development of hypostomal lobes forming a ventral hypostomal bridge. The Lepidopteran larvae, the hypostomal lobes do not unite together, while in other insects, they fuse at the middle forms a complete hypostomal bridge in order to close the foramen magnum ventrally. Then gula is a ventral sclerotic plate of the head capsule separating the foramen magnum from the base of labium. It is well developed in the insects, having prognathous head in order to place the mouth parts in forward direction. The gula is separated from the laterally expanded postgeny by the gular sutures. The gular sutures are in fact modified post-occipital sutures. The gula varies in length and width in different species of Coleoptera and Neuroptera.